The temperature gauge outside Chicago's Union Station read -18 degrees, and it was only getting colder. Marcus Calloway pressed his back against the brick wall of the abandoned warehouse, watching his breath form ice crystals in the air. 10 days ago, he'd been evicted from his last motel room. Now, as the worst winter storm in decades prepared to slam the city, he had nothing but a pile of discarded cardboard boxes and 20 years of military survival training that everyone assumed he'd forgotten. What they didn't know was that Marcus had once taught Arctic warfare to Navy SEALs, before the accident, before the addiction, before he lost everything. As police sirens wailed in the distance and the first snowflakes began to fall, Marcus began folding cardboard with the precision of an engineer. He had 10 nights to survive temperatures that would kill most people in hours. But the cold wasn't his only enemy. Someone had been following him, and they weren't planning to let him live to see spring. Marcus's hands moved with muscle memory as he assessed the cardboard, like he once evaluated military equipment. 3 refrigerator boxes, 2 washer boxes, and dozens of smaller containers. The cardboard was dry, a miracle in this weather, and relatively fresh. He'd learned long ago that dry insulation was the difference between life and death in extreme cold. The wind picked up, cutting through his threadbare jacket. He needed to work fast. The weather service had predicted -30, with wind chills approaching -50. Those weren't just numbers on a thermometer, they were a countdown to hypothermia, frostbite, and death. He broke down the largest refrigerator box, spreading it flat against the warehouse's recessed loading dock. This would be his foundation, creating a crucial barrier between his body and the concrete that would otherwise drain his heat like a vampire. Next came the walls, overlapping layers of cardboard creating air pockets that would trap warm air. The concept was simple: dead air space equals insulation. A shadow moved across the alley entrance, too deliberate to be coincidental. Marcus kept working, but shifted his position to maintain visual contact with all approach routes. Someone had been tracking him for 3 days now, always staying just outside direct line of sight. Professional surveillance, which meant either law enforcement or something worse. As he worked, fragments of his old life surfaced unbidden, teaching Marines how to dig snow caves in Alaska, explaining to wide-eyed recruits why a properly constructed shelter could keep you alive at -40 without external heat sources. Back when he wore stripes instead of stained clothing, when people looked at him with respect instead of disgust. The Humvee explosion had changed everything: traumatic brain injury, chronic pain, and then the pills that promised relief but delivered destruction instead. His commanding officers had been understanding at first, but understanding only stretched so far when you missed formations and failed drug tests. Honorable discharge became other than honorable, benefits evaporated, and the slow slide to the streets became inevitable. But they couldn't take away what was burned into his brain during 2 decades of service. Marcus cut precise ventilation holes near the roof of his emerging shelter. Too many homeless people died from carbon monoxide poisoning in sealed shelters. Fresh air circulation was non-negotiable, even if it meant some heat loss. He angled the vents to prevent wind from driving directly inside while still allowing airflow. The shadow appeared again, closer this time. Definitely male, medium build, wearing expensive winter gear that stood out in this neighborhood. Not a cop, wrong movement pattern. Private security maybe, or something darker. Marcus had made enemies during his military career, people who might hold grudges long enough to track down a broken soldier living in alleys. Snow began falling harder, fat flakes that promised accumulation. Good for insulation, bad for visibility and mobility. Marcus accelerated his construction, layering smaller boxes inside the main structure to create multiple insulation zones. He'd learned this technique from Inuit guides who'd taught his Arctic warfare classes, the principle of progressive warming zones that gradually adjusted body temperature from deadly cold to survivable cool. His fingers were already losing dexterity despite his worn gloves. He had maybe 30 more minutes of fine motor control before the cold began shutting down his extremities. The shelter needed to be finished before then, because fumbling with cardboard in the dark with frozen hands was a death sentence. The wind howled through the alley, driving the temperature even lower. Marcus could feel the cold seeping through his inadequate clothing, his body beginning the metabolic shift that preceded hypothermia. But his hands never stopped moving, folding and positioning cardboard with the mechanical precision that had once kept soldiers alive in impossible conditions. In the distance, the shadow watcher disappeared again, but Marcus knew he was still there, waiting, planning. Whatever vendetta had followed him from his old life to these streets, it wouldn't end with the storm. He was fighting a war on two fronts now, against nature's killing cold and against an enemy who wanted him dead before spring. But first, he had to survive tonight. The cardboard came from behind Chen's electronics, where Marcus had learned the old man threw out the good boxes every Tuesday morning, thick corrugated shipping containers that had once housed flat-screen televisions and computer monitors. Marcus waited until Chen locked up for the night before making his move, dragging the flattened boxes through the alley like a scavenger harvesting the bones of civilization. The temperature had dropped another 8 degrees since morning. The weather app on the cracked phone he'd managed to keep charged at the library showed a blue mass creeping down from Canada like a living thing. The polar vortex would hit full force by Thursday. That gave him 36 hours. Marcus spread the cardboard across the concrete loading dock behind the abandoned textile factory. His hands moved with muscle memory, unfolding each piece, testing the integrity of the corrugated ridges. In Afghanistan, he'd built shelters from salvaged metal sheeting and canvas scraps. The principles remained the same: insulation, wind resistance, structural stability. The materials had just gotten more desperate. He started with the foundation layer, creating a barrier between his body and the heat-sinking concrete. Double-wall construction with an air gap for insulation. The larger boxes became walls, their edges interlocked and reinforced with strips torn from smaller pieces. No tape, no glue, just engineering and desperation. The wind picked up as he worked, carrying the bite of Arctic air and something else, a smell he recognized but couldn't place. Metallic, sharp. It made the hair on his neck stand up in a way that had nothing to do with the cold. Marcus paused, scanning the empty lot. Shadows stretched long between the streetlights, creating pockets of darkness where anything could hide. A cat knocked over a trash can 3 blocks away, the clatter echoing off brick walls. Normal city sounds, nothing more. But his training said otherwise. 6 years in Army Rangers had taught him to trust his instincts, and right now, those instincts were screaming that he was being watched. He continued building, but his movements became more deliberate, strategic. The shelter took shape not just as protection from the elements, but as a defensive position. Multiple exit routes, clear sight lines, the kind of thinking that had kept him alive in hostile territory, now applied to surviving in his own country. The first wall went up using a modified A-frame design, angled to shed wind and distribute load. He'd learned the technique during survival training in Alaska, building emergency shelters from pine boughs and snow. The cardboard was weaker but more abundant, quantity over quality. As he worked, fragments of his old life surfaced like debris from a shipwreck, leading rescue operations in sub-zero conditions, teaching soldiers how to stay alive when everything wanted them dead. The respectful nods from superior officers, the medal ceremony where they'd called him a hero. That was before Sarah died, before the drinking, before the long slide into the place where heroes go to disappear. The second wall proved more challenging. The cardboard had started to absorb moisture from the air, weakening the structural bonds. Marcus improvised, using his bootlaces to create tension cables, transforming the flat surfaces into a tensioned framework. The mathematics of stress and load distribution played out in his mind like a familiar song. A footstep scraped against gravel somewhere behind him. Marcus froze, his hands still gripping a half-assembled wall section. He counted heartbeats. 1, 2, 3. Nothing. But the silence felt wrong now, too complete. Even the distant traffic had faded. He turned slowly, casually, as if adjusting his work angle. The lot stretched empty in all directions, but the shadows seemed deeper now, more purposeful. Something glinted briefly near the chain-link fence, then vanished. Glass? Eyes? A weapon? Marcus forced himself to continue working while his peripheral vision tracked movement. There, a shift in the darkness near the old loading bay. Too large for a rat, too deliberate for wind-blown trash. His fingers found the utility knife in his jacket pocket, the one tool he'd managed to keep through 2 years of losing everything else. The blade was dull but sharp enough. It would have to be. The third wall went up faster, his hands moving with practiced efficiency while his mind catalogued potential threats. Multiple attackers or single, armed or opportunistic, professional or random. The questions felt familiar, comforting even. This was a problem he understood, unlike the bureaucratic maze that had stripped away his benefits, his home, his identity. This was simple. Survive or die. The wind gusted stronger now, carrying that metallic smell again. Closer this time. Marcus positioned the final wall section, creating a reinforced corner where he could make his stand if necessary. Whatever was hunting him in the shadows could wait. The cold would kill him long before anything else got the chance, and that made it the priority threat. But as he sealed the entrance to his cardboard fortress, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that survival would require more than just staying warm. Something was coming for him, and it was far more dangerous than winter. The bitter wind cut through the city like a blade, and Marcus felt it in his bones, a familiar cold that whispered of darker things to come. He'd felt this kind of weather before, in places where men weren't meant to survive, where nature stripped away everything except the will to live. Standing in the alley behind Chen's electronics, he surveyed his newfound territory with tactical precision. The dumpster would provide windbreak from the northwest. The brick wall offered protection from the east, but it was the loading dock overhang that caught his attention, a natural shelter that could be fortified. Marcus began collecting cardboard with methodical purpose. Each piece was evaluated for structural integrity, size, and potential application. The large refrigerator box would form the core shelter. Smaller television boxes could serve as modular extensions. He moved efficiently, his military training bleeding through years of alcohol-induced rust. "Hey, buddy, you can't camp here." The voice belonged to a security guard, middle-aged and soft around the middle. Marcus sized him up automatically, no weapon visible, civilian posture, more concerned than aggressive. "Just cleaning up," Marcus replied, not looking up from his work. "Recycling." The guard studied the growing pile of flattened cardboard. "Yeah, well, make it quick. Management doesn't like transients hanging around." Marcus nodded, continuing his collection until the guard disappeared around the corner. He'd learned to become invisible, to move through the city's peripheral vision where the forgotten survived. As he worked, memories surfaced unbidden. Building emergency shelters in the Alaskan wilderness during survival training, teaching civilians how to construct windbreaks that could mean the difference between life and death. The irony wasn't lost on him. The skills he'd once used to save others now served only to keep himself breathing. The first layer went up quickly. Marcus had salvaged duct tape from various sources over the past weeks, hoarding it like currency. He reinforced the corners, overlapped the seams, and created a framework that could withstand significant wind pressure. But this wasn't just about staying warm. Something in his gut told him this shelter might need to serve other purposes. That feeling had been growing stronger since yesterday, the sensation of being watched, studied. In his darker moments, he wondered if paranoia was finally claiming him, the way it had claimed other veterans he'd known. But his instincts had kept him alive too many times to ignore them now. Marcus noticed the man across the street for the second time that day. Tall, dark coat, face obscured by the shadow of a building. The same man from this morning, he was certain. Professional surveillance tried to maintain plausible cover, but Marcus recognized the patterns, the careful positioning, the studied casualness that wasn't casual at all. He continued working on his shelter while tracking the watcher's position peripherally. The cardboard fortress grew more sophisticated with each addition. Triple-layered walls for insulation, ventilation gaps positioned to prevent condensation while maintaining heat. An emergency exit concealed beneath what appeared to be solid wall section. The temperature was dropping faster than the weather reports had predicted. Marcus could feel it in the way the air moved, the quality of the wind. This wasn't just winter settling in. Something meteorologically significant was building, the kind of Arctic blast that could kill the unprepared within hours. His hands moved with practiced efficiency, muscle memory guiding him through construction techniques learned in survival schools and refined in combat zones. Each fold, each tape placement served multiple purposes. The shelter wasn't just protection from weather, it was camouflage, fortress, and potential weapon all at once. By evening, the structure resembled an elaborate cardboard maze. Multiple chambers connected by crawl spaces, false walls hiding supply caches, sight lines that allowed observation of approach routes while remaining concealed. To a casual observer, it looked like an impressive homeless shelter. To Marcus, it was a command post. The watcher had changed positions twice, confirming Marcus's suspicions. Professional surveillance, definitely. But by whom and why? His mind raced through possibilities, military connections from his disgrace, creditors tracking down his last known associates, or something more sinister tied to the circumstances that had destroyed his life. As darkness fell, the temperature plummeted dramatically. Emergency weather alerts began sounding from phones and emergency broadcasts. Polar vortex, historic cold snap, shelter warnings for vulnerable populations. Marcus smiled grimly as he sealed himself into his cardboard fortress. Vulnerable population, if they only knew what he'd survived, what he was capable of surviving still. But as the wind began to howl through the alley with increasing fury, carrying ice crystals that stung like needles, he caught movement in his peripheral vision. The watcher was no longer across the street, no longer maintaining distance. Someone was approaching his shelter, moving with the careful footsteps of a predator closing on prey. Marcus reached for the broken bottle he'd positioned within arm's reach. His breathing slowed, muscles tensed. Some hunts never really ended, they just changed locations. The cardboard walls around him suddenly felt less like shelter and more like a trap. The cardboard beneath Marcus crackled like breaking ice as he shifted position, each movement calculated to preserve the precious heat trapped within his fortress. 3 layers of corrugated walls surrounded him now, with newspapers stuffed between them like primitive insulation. The construction had taken him 4 hours, working methodically despite his numb fingers, muscle memory from his military engineering days, guiding each fold and strategic placement. Outside, the wind had evolved into something monstrous. It no longer howled, it screamed, a banshee wail that seemed to penetrate his bones. The polar vortex had arrived ahead of schedule, according to the emergency broadcasts crackling from a homeless man's battery radio 2 blocks over. Temperatures were plummeting toward -30, with wind chills that could kill exposed skin in minutes. Marcus pressed his eye to a carefully positioned peephole and surveyed his domain. The alley had transformed into an Arctic wasteland. Snow whipped horizontally, creating white curtains that shifted and danced in the pale streetlight. Dumpsters wore caps of ice, and the fire escape ladder had become a crystalline sculpture. This was worse than anything he'd faced in Alaska, mainly because he'd had proper gear then, proper shelter, a team. Now he had cardboard and stubbornness. The fortress design was deceptively sophisticated. He'd angled the outer walls to deflect wind, creating a buffer zone that trapped warmer air. The entrance was a crawl-through tunnel that curved inward, preventing heat loss while allowing emergency exit. Inside, he'd fashioned a raised platform from wooden pallets discovered behind the restaurant, lifting his body off the frozen concrete. Every joint was sealed with duct tape scavenged from construction sites, creating an envelope that could theoretically keep him alive. Theoretically. His stomach cramped with hunger, but he ignored it. Food was secondary to heat generation. He flexed his muscles in isometric exercises, systematic contractions that forced blood circulation without requiring much movement. Shoulders, arms, core, legs, a rotating sequence he'd learned during survival training in Norway. The technique had saved his life during a blizzard near Tromsø when his squad had been trapped for 18 hours. That mission felt like another lifetime, another man. A new sound cut through the wind, footsteps crunching on snow. Marcus froze, every sense sharpening. Someone was moving through the alley with purpose, not the shuffling gait of another homeless person seeking shelter. These steps were measured, deliberate, hunting steps. Through his peephole, Marcus caught a glimpse of dark clothing moving between the snow curtains. The figure paused near the dumpster where Marcus had initially taken shelter, seeming to examine something. A flashlight beam swept the area in a grid pattern, professional and thorough. Marcus's breathing slowed automatically, falling into the rhythm he'd learned during reconnaissance missions. Shallow, quiet, invisible. His hand moved to the broken bottle he'd positioned near the entrance. Not much of a weapon, but better than nothing. The paranoia he'd been fighting suddenly didn't feel so irrational. The figure moved closer, and Marcus could make out more details. Heavy winter coat, military-style boots, movements that suggested training. Definitely not random. The flashlight beam probed the shadows around his fortress, coming close enough that Marcus could see the LED's harsh white glow through gaps in his cardboard walls. Then the beam stopped, fixed, pointed directly at his shelter. Marcus held his breath as footsteps approached. Slow, patient. The kind of approach used when you knew your prey was cornered. Through a crack near his feet, he watched the boots stop just outside his entrance tunnel. Black leather, steel-toed, barely touched by snow despite the conditions. Someone who knew how to move in winter weather. A voice spoke, barely audible over the wind, but close enough that Marcus heard every word. "I know you're in there, Marcus. We need to talk." The voice was calm, professional, not threatening exactly, but carrying the weight of authority. Marcus didn't recognize it, but something about the tone triggered old instincts. Military bearing, intelligence background maybe, the kind of voice that gave orders and expected obedience. "The storm's getting worse," the voice continued. "You can't stay out here much longer. Even that impressive little fort of yours won't hold against what's coming." Marcus remained silent, but his mind raced. How did they know his name? How had they found him so quickly after he'd moved locations? And why now, in the middle of a blizzard that should have kept everyone indoors? The boots shifted in the snow. "You have skills we need, Marcus. Skills that are going to waste out here. This doesn't have to be your ending. A job offer, in a blizzard, while he was hypothermic and hiding in cardboard." Marcus almost laughed at the absurdity, but something in the man's tone suggested this wasn't a joke. Someone wanted him badly enough to venture into a polar vortex to make contact. The question was whether they wanted to recruit him or eliminate him. Either way, his quiet desperation had just become significantly more complicated. The screaming wind had died to a whisper by dawn, but Marcus knew better than to trust the deceptive calm. His breath still clouded in the air inside his cardboard fortress, each exhalation a reminder that the polar vortex hadn't loosened its grip on the city. Through a carefully positioned gap in his shelter, he watched ice crystals dance in the pale morning light, beautiful and merciless. His body ached from the night's vigilance. Every muscle had remained coiled, ready to spring into action at the first sign of his stalker's return. But the shadows had stayed empty, filled only with the howling chorus of nature's fury. Perhaps the storm had driven even his hunter to seek better shelter. Marcus flexed his fingers, working feeling back into the tips. The military-issued hand warmers he'd salvaged from his pack had kept frostbite at bay, but barely. He needed to move, needed to generate heat and assess his situation in daylight. More importantly, he needed food and water. His emergency rations wouldn't last another day. Carefully, he began dismantling the entrance to his shelter, pulling away the intricately folded cardboard panels he'd engineered to create an airlock system. Each piece had been positioned with surgical precision, designed to trap warm air while preventing deadly drafts from penetrating his sanctuary. As he worked, muscle memory from countless Arctic missions guided his movements, economical, purposeful, silent. The first step outside hit him like a physical blow. The temperature had dropped even further overnight, probably sitting somewhere near -30. His nostrils burned with each breath, the air so cold it felt like inhaling needles. But he was alive, and his shelter had held. That counted as victory in his current circumstances. The alley looked like an alien landscape. Snow had drifted into impossible sculptures, carved by wind into shapes that defied logic. Ice coated every surface with a crystalline armor that reflected the weak sun in prismatic flashes. Most concerning was the silence. No traffic sounds, no human voices, no signs of life beyond the occasional creak of overburdened tree branches. Marcus pulled his knit cap lower and began moving through the snow, each step deliberate and calculated. He'd learned in Alaska that rushed movement in extreme cold was a death sentence. Sweat meant hypothermia. Exhaustion meant poor judgment. Poor judgment meant joining the frozen corpses that emergency crews would discover when the storm finally broke. 3 blocks from his shelter, he found what he was looking for, a small corner market with its security gate partially damaged by falling ice. The gap wasn't large enough for a normal break-in, but Marcus had never been accused of being normal. He studied the opening for several minutes, checking angles and sight lines, listening for any sound that might indicate he wasn't alone. The sensation of being watched had returned, a crawling awareness that made his scalp prickle despite the cold. He turned slowly, scanning the pristine snowscape for any sign of disturbance. There, barely visible tracks leading from a doorway across the street. Not animal tracks. The spacing was wrong, the depth inconsistent, as if someone had tried to step in existing footprints to mask their passage. His hunter had been here recently, probably watching the market just as Marcus was now. But why? Was it simply because resources were scarce, or was there something more deliberate about this cat-and-mouse game? Marcus slipped through the gap in the security gate, his lean frame allowing passage where others might have been trapped. Inside, emergency lighting cast everything in an eerie red glow. The store had been abandoned hastily, cash registers still open, a few bills scattered on the floor, merchandise knocked over in someone's rush to escape the storm's arrival. He worked quickly but methodically, gathering supplies into a salvaged shopping bag. Beef jerky, energy bars, bottled water, matches, a small camping lantern someone had apparently decided wasn't worth the carrying weight. Each item was evaluated not just for immediate need, but for weight and portability. He'd learned the hard way that everything you carried in survival situations eventually felt like it weighed 50 pounds. A sound from the back of the store froze him mid-reach for a package of batteries, a soft scraping, like fabric against metal. Marcus lowered himself into a crouch, using the shelving for cover while he strained to isolate the sound from the building's natural settling. There it was again, too rhythmic to be random, too purposeful to be accidental. Someone else was in the store. Marcus weighed his options with the cold calculation that had kept him alive through 3 tours in Afghanistan and 2 years of Arctic research missions. He could retreat, abandon his supply run and hope to find resources elsewhere. Or he could advance, determine if this was his shadowy stalker finally making a direct move. The scraping sound came again, closer now, accompanied by the whisper of footsteps on debris-covered linoleum. Marcus reached for the knife he kept strapped to his ankle, his fingers closing around the familiar grip as he prepared to discover whether he was predator or prey. Marcus pressed himself against the frozen brick wall of the abandoned warehouse, his breath forming crystalline clouds that dissipated into the merciless night air. The temperature had dropped another 15 degrees since sunset, and the polar vortex was tightening its grip on the city like a massive fist, but the cold wasn't what made his hands shake as he peered around the corner. 3 figures moved through the snow-covered alley with practiced precision, their boots crunching in deliberate rhythm. Even in the dim glow of the distant streetlight, Marcus recognized the tactical formation, a standard sweep pattern he'd used countless times during his military days. These weren't random thugs or desperate addicts looking for an easy mark. These were professionals. The lead figure raised his hand, and the trio stopped in unison. Marcus caught a glimpse of military-grade thermal imaging equipment scanning the area where his cardboard fortress stood. His carefully constructed shelter, built from refrigerator boxes and reinforced with salvaged insulation, suddenly looked pathetically inadequate against whatever these men represented. Marcus's mind raced through possibilities. Had someone discovered his true identity? The Marcus Kane who'd once led rescue operations in the Alaskan wilderness was supposed to be dead to the world, buried beneath layers of disgrace and bureaucratic cover-ups. He'd spent months perfecting his invisibility among the homeless population, becoming just another forgotten face on the streets. The wind howled between the buildings, carrying with it the promise of deadly sub-zero temperatures. Marcus felt the familiar tingle in his extremities that preceded frostbite, but moving now would expose his position. He'd survived worse conditions in the Arctic, but never while being hunted. The lead figure spoke into a radio, his words lost in the wind. Marcus strained to listen, catching only fragments, no visual confirmation, and expand the perimeter. Whatever they wanted with him, they were taking it seriously. A memory surfaced from his time in Alaska, a conversation with his former commanding officer about assets who knew too much. Sometimes the best way to handle a problem, Colonel Richardson had said, is to let the environment do the work for you. Marcus had thought it was theoretical at the time. The irony wasn't lost on him. He'd spent years teaching others how to survive nature's worst conditions, only to find himself using those same skills to hide from men who might have learned them from him. One of the figures broke away from the group and began moving toward Marcus's hiding spot. The man's movements were smooth and confident, despite the treacherous ice coating the alley floor. Marcus recognized the gait of someone trained in cold weather operations. Marcus slowly reached into his coat and wrapped his fingers around the makeshift knife he'd crafted from a broken piece of rebar. It wasn't much, but he'd learned long ago that survival often came down to being slightly more prepared than your opponent expected. The approaching figure paused 20 feet away, his head turning methodically as he scanned the shadows. Marcus could see the man's breath coming in controlled puffs, the breathing pattern of someone managing his heart rate. Professional indeed. A sudden gust of wind sent an empty can clattering across the alley behind the searcher. The man spun toward the sound, and Marcus saw his chance. Moving with the silent precision of his military training, he slipped from his hiding spot and began working his way toward the rear of the warehouse. The building's back entrance was secured with a rusted chain and padlock, but Marcus had scouted it days earlier as a potential emergency exit. He pulled out a bent coat hanger he'd modified into a makeshift lockpick. His fingers were numb with cold, making the delicate work nearly impossible, but desperation gave him focus. Behind him, he heard the searcher's radio crackle to life. Negative on the south approach. Moving to secondary position. The lock clicked open just as Marcus heard footsteps approaching from multiple directions. They were closing the net. He slipped inside the warehouse and immediately felt the slight temperature difference, maybe 10 degrees warmer, enough to buy him precious time. The interior was a maze of abandoned machinery and collapsed sections of roof that had created natural shelter pockets. Snow had drifted through the broken windows, but Marcus spotted what he needed, a clear path to the far end of the building and another exit he'd marked weeks ago. As he moved through the shadows, Marcus tried to piece together why he was being hunted. His discharge from the service had been messy but officially clean. The incident that ended his career, the rescue mission that went catastrophically wrong, had been classified and buried, or so he'd been told. The warehouse door behind him creaked open and a beam of tactical lighting swept across the floor. Marcus dropped behind a rusted conveyor belt as voices echoed through the cavernous space. "He's in here," someone whispered. "Thermal shows residual heat." Marcus closed his eyes and let his training take over. The cold was his enemy, but it had also been his teacher. Tonight, he would need both lessons to survive. The cardboard walls groaned against the wind like a dying animal. Marcus pressed his back against the reinforced corner, feeling the vibrations travel through his makeshift fortress as another gust hammered the structure. 3 hours until dawn, and the temperature had dropped another 5 degrees. His breath came in short puffs that crystallized instantly in the sub-zero air. He'd lost feeling in his left foot completely now. Even through the newspaper insulation and plastic bag barrier, the cold had found its way in. The military had taught him about progressive hypothermia, how it crept through your body like a patient predator, shutting down extremities first before moving toward your core. He flexed his toes repeatedly, trying to maintain circulation, but the numbness was spreading. A sound cut through the howling wind. Not the familiar creak of settling cardboard or the whistle of air through cracks he'd missed. This was different, deliberate. Footsteps. Marcus froze, straining to listen. There, the soft crunch of snow being compressed under weight. Someone was moving around his shelter, circling it with the careful patience of a hunter studying prey. His hand instinctively reached for the piece of rebar he'd positioned near the entrance. The metal burned against his palm, so cold it felt like fire, but he gripped it anyway. Through a gap in the cardboard, he caught a glimpse of movement. A dark figure passed by the opening, too quick to make out details, but large enough to be a man. The footsteps stopped directly in front of his entrance. Marcus held his breath, watching the narrow slit he'd left uncovered for ventilation. A beam of light suddenly pierced through, a flashlight sweeping across the interior of his shelter. The light lingered on his supplies, the careful arrangement of his sleeping area, the reinforcement patterns he'd built into the walls. "I know you're in there." The voice was gravelly, weathered by years of cigarettes and hard living. "Saw you building this little palace yesterday. Pretty impressive work for a bum." Marcus remained silent, calculating distances. The entrance was 3 feet to his left. If he moved fast, he could burst through and catch whoever this was off guard. But in his current condition, weakened by cold and hunger, he'd only get one chance. "Name's Eddie," the voice continued conversationally. "Live in the building across the alley. Been watching you for a few days now. You're different from the usual street trash that comes through here. Military, right? Can tell by how you move, how you think." The light disappeared, but the presence remained. Marcus could hear breathing just outside the cardboard wall. "Here's the thing about being homeless in winter," Eddie said. "It's not the cold that kills most people. It's other people. Funny how desperation makes animals out of decent folks, or maybe it just shows what was always there underneath." A scraping sound. Metal against concrete. Marcus's grip tightened on his rebar as he realized Eddie was dragging something heavy across the ground. "You picked a bad spot for your fort, military man. This is my territory, has been for 3 years, and I don't like sharing." The smell hit Marcus before he understood what was happening. Gasoline. The sharp chemical stench seeping through the cardboard walls made his stomach lurch. Eddie was pouring accelerant around the perimeter of his shelter. "Nothing personal," Eddie continued, his voice moving as he circled the structure. "But resources are limited out here. Food, decent shelter spots, places the cops don't hassle you. Can't have someone with your skills setting up shop in my backyard. Bad for business." Marcus's mind raced through options. The shelter had only one exit, a critical design flaw he'd overlooked in his focus on thermal efficiency. If Eddie lit the gasoline, the cardboard would go up in seconds. Even if he survived the initial flash, he'd be trapped in a burning box. The sound of a lighter flicking open cut through the wind. Marcus didn't hesitate. He drove his shoulder into the back wall of the shelter, where he'd deliberately weakened the adhesive between 2 large sections. The cardboard gave way, and he rolled through into the snow just as orange light flickered behind him. The flames caught faster than he'd expected. His carefully constructed fortress, hours of work, his only protection against the deadly cold, disappeared in a roar of fire and smoke. The heat felt good for exactly 3 seconds before the reality hit him. He was back to square one. exposed to the elements with no shelter and temperatures still dropping. Eddie stood silhouetted against the flames, holding a crowbar that explained the scraping sounds. He was bigger than Marcus had expected, with the kind of bulk that came from years of manual labor before the streets claimed him. "Should have just moved on when I told you to," Eddie said, raising the crowbar. "Now we do this the hard way." Marcus struggled to his feet, still gripping the rebar. His left leg nearly buckled. The cold had done more damage than he'd realized. But his military training kicked in, muscle memory overriding physical weakness. The real fight was just beginning. The wind had stopped. Marcus pressed his ear against the cardboard wall, listening to the unnatural silence that had settled over the city like a funeral shroud. After hours of howling gusts that threatened to tear his fortress apart, the sudden calm felt more ominous than comforting. In his experience, nature's quietest moments often preceded her most violent tantrums. He checked his watch. 3:47 a.m. The polar vortex had been battering the city for nearly 6 hours, and according to the last weather report he'd caught on a passerby's radio, the worst was yet to come. Temperatures had already dropped to -23 degrees Fahrenheit, turning the urban landscape into a crystalline wasteland that claimed the unprepared without mercy. The cardboard fortress had held better than he'd dared hope. His military engineering training, rusty but not forgotten, had guided him in creating a structure that channeled wind rather than fighting it. Multiple layers of corrugated material created insulation pockets, while strategic anchor points distributed stress across the entire framework. But it was the human element that worried him most. Marcus adjusted the torn sleeping bag around his shoulders and reached for the thermos tucked against his chest. The last of the coffee had gone cold hours ago, but the metal container still retained enough warmth to keep his core temperature stable. He'd learned in Alaska that survival wasn't about comfort, it was about maintaining the razor-thin margin between life and death, degree by degree, breath by breath. A soft, scraping sound made him freeze. Something was moving outside the fortress, and it wasn't the wind. The sound came again, deliberate, methodical, like claws against concrete. Marcus's hand instinctively moved to the tactical knife hidden in his boot, muscle memory overriding years of civilian softness. Whatever had been stalking him earlier hadn't been deterred by the storm. Through a carefully constructed observation slit, he peered into the snow-covered alley. The streetlight at the far end cast everything in an amber glow that turned the falling snow into dancing spirits. Shadows moved wrong in the cold, stretched and distorted by the strange physics of extreme weather. But there, near the dumpster where he'd salvaged construction materials, something crouched that didn't belong to the natural world of winter. The figure was human-shaped, but moved with an animal's predatory grace. Even at this distance, Marcus could see that whoever it was wore inadequate clothing for the conditions. Thin jacket, no visible hat or gloves. Yet they showed no signs of being affected by the killing cold that would drop an unprepared person in minutes. Marcus controlled his breathing, each exhale measured to minimize the vapor cloud that might give away his position. The tactical part of his mind catalogued possibilities. Drug-enhanced tolerance to cold, military-grade gear designed to look civilian, or someone so focused on their hunt that they'd pushed past their body's normal warning systems. None of the options were reassuring. The figure straightened and turned toward his hiding place with mechanical precision. For a heart-stopping moment, Marcus thought he'd been spotted. But then he realized the stalker was following his trail. The disturbed snow, the scuff marks on brick walls, the tiny indicators that someone with training would recognize as breadcrumbs leading directly to his fortress. He'd been careless. Survival had consumed so much of his attention that he'd forgotten about evasion, about covering his tracks. In the Arctic, the environment was usually the only enemy. Here, he was dealing with something that combined nature's lethality with human intelligence. Moving with practiced silence, Marcus began preparing for the worst. He checked his knife's accessibility and identified potential escape routes. The loose cardboard panel he designed as an emergency exit, the fire escape ladder just visible through the swirling snow. His fortress had been built for weather, not warfare, but some of the same principles applied. The scraping sound grew closer, more deliberate. Through the observation slit, he watched the figure move from cover to cover with military precision, using doorways and debris to mask their approach. This wasn't random violence or desperation. This was someone with training, someone who understood tactics. Marcus felt the familiar weight of command decisions settling on his shoulders. Stay hidden and hope the fortress's camouflage held, or take the initiative and engage on his terms. In the military, hesitation killed more soldiers than enemy action. But here, alone and underprepared, the wrong choice would end everything. The figure stopped 15 feet away, head tilted in a listening posture that Marcus recognized from his own training. They knew he was here. The hunt had become a siege, and his cardboard walls suddenly felt as fragile as they actually were. Snow began falling harder, the brief, calm ending as the polar vortex gathered strength for its next assault. Whatever happened in the next few minutes would determine whether Marcus survived to see dawn or became another casualty of a winter that had already claimed too much. The stalker took another step forward, and Marcus tightened his grip on the knife. The cardboard walls trembled as another gust of Arctic wind slammed into Marcus's fortress. Ice crystals had formed on the inner surfaces despite his body heat, creating a glittering membrane that reminded him of the observation windows in the military's cold-weather training facility. Back when he had a name that meant something, back when people listened when he spoke. He pressed his eye to the small observation slit he'd carved near the entrance, scanning the white wasteland beyond. The storm had intensified overnight, transforming the familiar landscape of the abandoned lot into an alien moonscape of snowdrifts and shadows. Somewhere in that chaos, he knew they were still out there. The radio crackled to life, startling him from his surveillance. Emergency shelters opening downtown. Repeat, this is not a drill. Temperatures expected to drop to -35 degrees. All homeless individuals should... Marcus clicked it off. Downtown meant exposure. It meant crossing 6 blocks of open ground with whatever was tracking him still out there. He'd seen the footprints circling his position during yesterday's brief lull in the storm, too large to be human, too deliberate to be animal. His stomach cramped with hunger, a sharp reminder that his last meal had been the half-frozen sandwich he'd found 2 days ago. The protein bars from his emergency cache were long gone, and melting snow for water was depleting his precious fuel supply. Every calorie burned was borrowed time against the cold. The sound came again, that low, almost subsonic growl that seemed to vibrate through the frozen ground itself. Marcus's hand instinctively moved to the makeshift spear he'd fashioned from a broken mop handle and a shard of metal. His military training screamed at him to identify the threat, establish fields of fire, create an escape route, but everything beyond these cardboard walls was a death trap. He thought of Sarah, wondered if she was watching the weather reports, if some part of her worried about the homeless population caught in this unprecedented cold snap. The irony wasn't lost on him. The man who'd once taught survival to elite soldiers was now trapped in a cardboard box, slowly freezing to death while something inhuman stalked him through a blizzard. The observation slit suddenly darkened. Marcus held his breath, spear raised. Through the narrow opening, he could see something massive blocking his view, a shadow that moved with predatory intelligence. The cardboard near his face began to bow inward as pressure was applied from outside. Then it spoke. Marcus Chen, former captain, dishonorably discharged for refusing to follow orders in Operation Arctic Shield. The voice was like grinding ice, somehow familiar yet impossibly wrong. We know what you saw in those caves. The pressure on the wall increased. Marcus scrambled backward, his thermal layers catching on the rough cardboard edges. How did it know his name, his rank? Operation Arctic Shield had been classified beyond top secret, buried so deep that even he wasn't sure it had really happened anymore. The things you reported, the specimens you helped contain. Did you think we'd forgotten? Memory flooded back like Arctic water breaching a seal. The caves beneath the Alaskan permafrost, the things they'd found there, things that shouldn't exist. The order to eliminate witnesses, his refusal, the court-martial that had stripped him of everything he'd ever been. We've been waiting, Marcus. Waiting for the conditions to be right. Waiting for you to be alone. The wall began to tear. Through the growing gap, Marcus caught a glimpse of something that made his mind recoil. Pale flesh stretched over bones that were wrong, eyes that reflected light like a nocturnal predator's, fingers that ended in claws designed for more than simple killing. He lunged for the rear wall of his shelter, tearing through the emergency exit he'd prepared. The cardboard parted like tissue as he burst through into the howling storm beyond. The cold hit him like a physical blow, stealing his breath and sending ice crystals stabbing into his lungs. Behind him, his fortress collapsed in a cascade of cardboard and snow as something large forced its way through. Marcus ran, his boots finding purchase on the treacherous ground through muscle memory and desperation. The storm was his ally now, obscuring his heat signature and muffling his footsteps. The abandoned building loomed ahead through the white curtain of snow, 3 stories of broken windows and graffitied concrete that had become as familiar as home. Marcus had explored every inch of it during his months on the street, mapping escape routes and hidey holes out of paranoid habit. He reached the loading dock as claws scraped across concrete behind him, too close, gaining fast. The service door hung open on rusted hinges, a black mouth leading into deeper darkness. Marcus dove through just as something massive slammed into the doorframe behind him, too large to follow, for now. In the echoing silence of the abandoned building, Marcus pressed his back against the cold concrete wall and tried to process what was happening. They'd found him. After all these years, Operation Arctic Shield had finally come home to collect its debts. The scream that tore from Marcus's throat was raw, primal, echoing off the concrete walls of the underpass like a war cry. The shadow figure stumbled backward, momentarily startled by the sudden ferocity of its prey turning predator. Marcus didn't hesitate. Years of military conditioning flooded back through his frozen limbs as he launched himself forward, the makeshift spear gripped tight in his frostbitten hands. The figure raised something metallic, a blade that caught the dim streetlight filtering through the storm, but Marcus was already inside its guard. The spear tip, sharpened from a broken piece of rebar he'd salvaged days ago, caught the attacker in the shoulder. The figure grunted, a distinctly human sound that sent both relief and terror through Marcus. Human he could deal with, human had weaknesses. They crashed together into the cardboard wall of his fortress, the carefully constructed barrier crumpling under their combined weight. Marcus rolled with the impact, using momentum to pin his attacker beneath him. The wind howled above them, drowning out the sounds of their struggle. "Who are you?" Marcus snarled through chattering teeth, pressing the spear point against the figure's throat. But even as he spoke, he was already pulling back the dark hood that concealed his hunter's face. The streetlight revealed a woman, maybe 40, with scarred features and eyes like chips of ice. Blood seeped from the wound in her shoulder, steaming in the frigid air. She smiled, and Marcus's blood turned colder than the Arctic wind. "You don't remember me, do you, Sergeant Chen?" Her voice was a whisper that somehow carried over the storm's rage. "Afghanistan, the village you abandoned." The name hit Marcus like a physical blow. Chen, his old unit designation. The memories came flooding back. The mission that went sideways, the village they'd been forced to evacuate under heavy fire. But there had been someone left behind. Someone they couldn't reach. "Kozlov," he breathed, "you're supposed to be dead." Death would have been kinder. She shifted beneath him, and he pressed the spear harder against her throat. A thin line of blood appeared. 3 years in Taliban custody. 3 years of asking myself why my unit abandoned me. Marcus's grip on the spear wavered. The official report had listed Elena Kozlov as Kia when they couldn't extract her from the collapsed building. Command had made the call. One soldier wasn't worth risking the entire unit. He'd followed orders, but the guilt had eaten at him for years. "We thought you were dead." The building came down. We couldn't. What? Dig a little harder? Wait a little longer? Kozlov's laugh was bitter as the wind. I called for help for 6 hours under that rubble before they found me. 6 hours listening to our helicopters fly away. The storm intensified above them, and Marcus could feel the temperature dropping even further. His exposed skin was going numb, and he knew hypothermia would claim them both if this standoff continued much longer. But Kozlov seemed immune to the cold, driven by a hatred that burned hotter than any fire. I spent 3 years planning this, she continued, her voice steadied despite the blood loss. Tracking you down, waiting for the perfect moment when you'd lost everything, just like you left me with nothing. Marcus's mind raced. The fortress was compromised, the storm was worsening, and he had a trained killer beneath his spear who clearly wasn't going down easily. But something in her words nagged at him. You've been following me for weeks, he realized. The food that went missing, the feeling of being watched. You could have killed me any time. Death was never the plan. Kozlov's eyes glittered with malevolent satisfaction. I wanted you to suffer first, lose your career, your home, your dignity. I wanted you to know what abandonment really feels like. The pieces clicked into place with horrifying clarity. The investigation, the missing funds, that was you. Child's play for someone with my training. Amazing how easy it is to destroy a man's life with the right computer access and a few strategic lies. She coughed, blood speckling her lips. But this storm, this is perfect. No witnesses when I finally end your miserable existence. Marcus felt the walls of his carefully constructed world crashing down around him like his cardboard fortress. Everything, the disgrace, the homelessness, the slow spiral into despair, it had all been orchestrated by a ghost from his past. The wind screamed through the underpass with renewed fury, and somewhere in the distance he could hear the groan of metal as the storm's force bent streetlights and signs to their breaking point. The polar vortex was reaching its peak, and they were trapped together in this concrete tomb with nowhere to run. Kozlov smiled again, and Marcus realized with growing horror that dying in this storm might have been her plan all along. A murder-suicide that would look like two homeless people who simply couldn't survive the cold. The cardboard walls groaned under the weight of accumulated ice as Marcus pressed his back against the reinforced corner he'd designated as his command post. Through a carefully positioned gap in his fortress, he watched the shadows dance beyond the reach of his small fire. The polar vortex had intensified overnight, turning the air itself into a weapon that cut through exposed skin like razors. But the cold wasn't his immediate concern anymore. The footprints he'd discovered earlier had multiplied. Fresh tracks circled his shelter in a deliberate pattern, too deliberate to be coincidental wandering. Someone was studying his defenses, probing for weaknesses. Marcus had spent enough time in hostile territory to recognize reconnaissance when he saw it. His breath formed crystalline clouds as he checked the improvised alarm system he'd rigged around the perimeter. Empty cans, threaded with fishing line from a nearby dumpster, positioned to create noise at the slightest disturbance. So far, they remained silent, but that only meant his stalker was skilled enough to avoid them. The military training that had kept him alive in the Arctic came flooding back with uncomfortable clarity. Trust no one, assume hostile intent, maintain situational awareness at all costs. These weren't lessons he'd expected to apply on the streets of his own city, but survival adapted to circumstances. A soft scraping sound made him freeze, metal against concrete, barely audible above the wind's howling. Marcus's hand moved instinctively to the sharpened piece of rebar he'd fashioned into a crude weapon. The sound came again, closer this time, from the direction of his main entrance. He'd built multiple exit points into his fortress design, a lesson learned from watching too many soldiers die in single-exit bunkers. Now he blessed that paranoia as he low-crawled toward his secondary escape route, a carefully concealed panel he could push open from the inside. The scraping stopped. In the sudden silence, Marcus could hear his own heartbeat thundering in his ears. Whoever was out there had either given up or was preparing to make their move. The first impact came without warning, a violent strike against the eastern wall that sent shockwaves through the entire structure. Cardboard might have been his only building material, but Marcus had engineered it well. The blow, devastating as it was, didn't breach his defenses. "I know you're in there." The voice was calm, almost conversational, with an accent Marcus couldn't immediately place. "This doesn't have to be difficult." Marcus remained silent, controlling his breathing the way he'd been trained. "Give away nothing. Let them make assumptions." Another impact, this time against the western wall, testing different points, looking for structural weaknesses. Marcus realized with growing dread that this wasn't random violence or opportunistic robbery. This was systematic, professional. "You have something that belongs to my employer," the voice continued. "Return it, and I'll make this quick. Keep playing games and I'll let the cold do my work for me." Marcus's mind raced through possibilities. He owned nothing of value, hadn't for months, unless this was connected to his former life, to the Arctic expedition that had destroyed his reputation and his career. But that was over 2 years ago. Why would anyone care about it now? The third impact came from above. His attacker had climbed onto something, probably the dumpster he'd positioned his fortress behind, and was now testing his roof. Marcus had reinforced it with layers of flattened boxes and plastic sheeting, but it wouldn't hold under sustained assault. He made his decision. Rolling toward his escape route, Marcus pushed through the concealed panel and emerged into the howling wind. The polar vortex hit him like a physical blow, driving ice crystals into his exposed face and hands. But pain was irrelevant now. Survival was everything. He moved in a crouch, using the storm as cover, circling wide around his fortress. Through the blowing snow, he caught a glimpse of his attacker, a figure in dark winter gear, methodically, dismantling his roof with some kind of prying tool. Professional equipment, military precision. This wasn't about robbery, this was about silencing him. Marcus closed the distance between them, his movements silent despite the treacherous footing. Years of Arctic operations had taught him to move like a ghost in winter conditions. His makeshift weapon felt inadequate, but surprise would be his greatest advantage. The figure sensed something at the last moment, beginning to turn just as Marcus struck. But the ice-slicked surface betrayed them both. Instead of landing a clean blow, Marcus slipped, his weapon glancing off his attacker's shoulder. They went down together in a tangle of limbs and curses, rolling through the snow as each fought for advantage. Marcus's opponent was younger, stronger, better equipped, but Marcus had desperation on his side, and desperation made men dangerous. The fight was brutal and brief. When it ended, Marcus found himself alone in the storm, gasping and bleeding, staring down at an unconscious figure whose pockets held answers he wasn't sure he wanted to discover. The footsteps had stopped, but Marcus knew better than to trust the silence. His breath came in controlled puffs as he crouched behind a snow-covered dumpster, the cardboard armor beneath his coat providing crucial insulation against the metal's bite. The thermal layers he'd engineered were working, but his body heat was creating a faint vapor signature that could give him away. 3 blocks from his fortress, the urban landscape felt alien and exposed. Streetlights cast orange pools that he avoided, sticking to the shadows between buildings where the darkness offered cover. The polar vortex had transformed the familiar neighborhood into something hostile and otherworldly. Ice formations hung like crystalline daggers from fire escapes, and the wind carved strange symphonies through the skeletal architecture. A distant crunch of snow made him freeze. North, maybe 50 yards. Moving with purpose, not the random shuffle of another homeless person seeking shelter. Marcus had spent enough nights on these streets to recognize the difference between desperation and predation. He pressed himself deeper into the shadows, feeling the corrugated ridges of his cardboard chest piece redistribute the pressure. The design was holding up better than he'd hoped. Military principles applied to civilian materials, it was working just like in Afghanistan when they'd improvised armor from scavenged metal and Kevlar scraps. The memory triggered something else. Rodriguez, his old squad mate, describing how the Taliban would flush them out during winter operations. Create noise in one direction, then attack from another. Basic hunting tactics that worked whether you were tracking insurgents or homeless veterans. Marcus closed his eyes and listened. The wind was constant, a baseline of sound that masked movement. But underneath it, he caught something else, the faint whisper of fabric against fabric. Someone moving carefully, deliberately, professional. He needed to get back to his fortress, but not directly. Leading them to his sanctuary would be suicide. Instead, he began moving east, using the alley system he'd mapped during weeks of scavenging. Every 20 yards he stopped and listened. The presence was still there, matching his pace, staying parallel. The cold was becoming a factor. Even with his innovations, prolonged exposure would sap his strength. His fingers were starting to lose dexterity, and his toes had gone numb despite the newspaper insulation in his boots. Hypothermia worked in stages. First you lost fine motor control, then gross motor function, then cognitive ability. He was still in stage 1, but the window was narrowing. A streetlight flickered ahead, the electrical system struggling against the cold. In the strobing illumination, Marcus caught a glimpse of movement, a figure in dark clothing definitely tracking him. Not close enough to see details, but the silhouette was wrong for a random predator. Too coordinated, too patient. Marcus ducked into a recessed doorway and pulled out the makeshift knife he'd crafted from a broken tent stake. The handle was wrapped in strips of cardboard and duct tape, providing grip even with numb fingers. It wasn't much, but it was something. The footsteps were getting closer now, no longer trying to mask their approach. Whoever it was had decided stealth was less important than closing distance. Marcus felt the familiar calm that came before contact, the same mental state that had kept him alive in combat zones halfway around the world. He counted the steps. 15 feet, 10, 5. A shape rounded the corner, and Marcus saw him clearly for the first time. Not as large as he'd expected, but moving with the fluid efficiency of someone who knew how to hurt people. Dark jacket, knit cap, something metallic glinting in his right hand. Their eyes met across the narrow alley. For a moment, neither moved. The stranger's face was lean, weathered, with the kind of scars that came from violence rather than accidents. His gaze was calculating, professional. This wasn't random street crime. "Marcus Chen," the man said, his voice barely audible over the wind, not a question. Marcus didn't respond, but his grip tightened on the improvised weapon. The use of his name confirmed what he'd begun to suspect. This was connected to his past, to the life he'd tried to leave behind when everything fell apart. "You're a hard man to find," the stranger continued, taking a step closer. "Took us weeks to track you down here." Us, plural. Marcus's peripheral vision caught movement on the fire escape above, a second figure, positioned for overwatch. Classic tactical formation. These weren't street thugs or random killers, they were professionals, and they'd been hunting him specifically. The wind howled between the buildings, driving snow in horizontal sheets that stung exposed skin. The temperature was still dropping, and Marcus realized the cold might be the least of his problems. Whatever he'd done, whatever bridges he'd burned in his former life, the past had finally caught up with him. He shifted his weight, feeling the cardboard armor creak softly beneath his layers. Time to find out if his survival skills extended beyond staying warm. Marcus pressed his back against the ice-coated dumpster, his breath forming crystalline clouds in the frigid air. The footsteps had stopped, but that only made his pulse race faster. In his experience, predators went silent just before they struck. The cardboard fortress he'd built 3 blocks away felt like a distant memory now. What had started as a desperate search for batteries at the abandoned electronics store had turned into a deadly game of cat and mouse. The moment he'd spotted the surveillance van parked across from the shelter, he'd known they'd found him. Hawthorne's people had to be. A metallic scrape echoed from somewhere to his left. Marcus dropped into a crouch, his military training flooding back despite the months of malnutrition and exposure. The knife he'd salvaged from the restaurant dumpster felt inadequate in his frozen fingers, but it was better than nothing. "I know you're here, Marcus," the voice carried on the wind, artificially calm, professional. "You can't run forever." "Not in this cold." Marcus recognized the tone, the same calculated patience he'd once used when tracking insurgents through Afghan mountain passes. These weren't street thugs or desperate addicts. These were operators. He closed his eyes and listened, filtering out the howling wind to focus on the subtle sounds beneath: boot leather on concrete, the slight wheeze of someone breathing through a tactical mask. At least two of them, maybe three, moving in a coordinated sweep pattern. The polar vortex had driven everyone else indoors, leaving the industrial district eerily deserted. No witnesses, no help. Just Marcus and whoever wanted him dead badly enough to hunt him through sub-zero temperatures. A shadow moved past the gap between buildings. Marcus caught a glimpse of tactical gear, night vision goggles, military-grade winter equipment. Definitely Hawthorne's crew. The kind of mercenaries who charged premium rates and always delivered. Marcus thought of Elena, probably worried sick when he didn't return to the fortress. The irony wasn't lost on him. He'd survived 18 months in some of the world's most hostile environments, only to be cornered in an American alley like a common criminal. Marcus Chen, formerly Staff Sergeant Chen, 10th Mountain Division. Another voice, this one coming from behind. They were closing the noose. Arctic survival specialist, dishonorably discharged for striking a superior officer. Current status, homeless vagrant with a price on his head. The casual recitation of his life's failures stung more than the wind chill. Marcus shifted his weight, testing the ice beneath his boots, slippery but manageable if he was careful. "You cost Mr. Hawthorne a lot of money, Marcus. That Siberian expedition you sabotaged? 20 million in losses. He takes that personally." Marcus almost laughed. Sabotaged. Is that what they were calling it? He'd tried to save lives when Hawthorne's reckless cost-cutting had put the entire team in danger, but corporate accountability had different rules than military justice. The wind picked up, driving snow crystals like tiny bullets against his exposed skin. The temperature was dropping fast. Even these professionals wouldn't be able to stay out here much longer. That might be his only advantage. A boot crunched on ice, closer now. Marcus gripped the knife tighter and made his choice. He rolled left as the first operative rounded the corner, the man's rifle tracking toward where Marcus had been crouched. The knife found the gap between the operator's vest and collar before he could adjust his aim. The man dropped without a sound, crimson spreading across the fresh snow. "Contact! Southeast corner!" Gunfire erupted, muzzle flashes strobing in the darkness. Marcus was already moving, using the maze of dumpsters and loading docks for cover. Bullets sparked off metal and concrete, the sharp cracks echoing between buildings. His combat instincts took over completely now. Calculate angles, identify cover, move with purpose. The cold that had been his enemy became an ally. These hunters might have better equipment, but they weren't adapted to the brutal conditions like he was. Marcus vaulted over a loading dock railing and landed hard on the far side. His ankle twisted, sending a spike of pain up his leg, but he forced himself to keep moving. Behind him, boots thundered in pursuit. "He's heading for the freight yard. Cut him off." The abandoned train cars loomed ahead, their bulk offering better concealment than the open alley. Marcus limped toward them, his breath ragged, the knife still slick with blood in his grip. Elena was counting on him to return. The other homeless souls who'd found shelter in his cardboard fortress were counting on him. He'd failed his unit in Afghanistan, failed Hawthorne's expedition, failed at almost everything that mattered. But he wouldn't fail them. Not tonight. Marcus disappeared into the shadows between the freight cars, leaving only footprints in the snow and the promise of violence yet to come. The hunters had become the hunted, and this was his territory now. The wind screamed through the alley with renewed fury, carrying ice crystals that felt like broken glass against Marcus's exposed skin. He pressed himself deeper into his cardboard fortress, feeling the walls shudder with each gust. The temperature had dropped another 10 degrees in the past hour, and even his carefully constructed shelter was beginning to show signs of structural failure. But the cold wasn't his biggest concern anymore. Through a carefully concealed observation port he'd built into the eastern wall, Marcus watched 3 dark figures moving through the storm. They moved with purpose, not the random wandering of other homeless seeking shelter. These men had military bearing, their steps coordinated despite the howling wind. They were searching for something, for someone. Marcus's hand instinctively moved to the makeshift knife he'd fashioned from a broken piece of metal. His military training kicked in, muscle memory overriding the fog of exhaustion and hunger that had plagued him for weeks. He counted their weapons, noted their formation, calculated distances and angles. The lead figure stopped 50 yards from his position and raised a hand. The other 2 spread out, moving to flank positions that would cut off any escape routes from the alley. Professional, deadly. Marcus closed his eyes and forced himself to think. Who were these people? His mind raced through possibilities. Russian operatives seeking revenge for his last mission? Corporate mercenaries hired by someone who wanted his knowledge silenced permanently? Or something else entirely? The cardboard walls around him suddenly felt pathetically inadequate. What had seemed like ingenious survival engineering moments before now felt like a paper tomb. But as he examined his fortress with fresh tactical eyes, he began to see possibilities he'd missed before. Moving with practiced silence, Marcus began systematically weakening specific support joints in his structure. If they wanted to corner him, he'd give them a surprise. He retrieved the small pile of accelerant he'd been saving for emergency warmth, lighter fluid from discarded lighters, some cooking oil he'd found, and began applying it strategically to certain sections of cardboard. Through his observation port, he watched the lead figure gesture toward his shelter. They'd found him. Marcus lit a match. The eastern wall of his fortress erupted in flames just as the first operative rounded the corner. The sudden burst of light and heat created chaos in the storm-darkened alley. Marcus used the distraction to kick out the weakened northern wall and roll through the opening, coming up behind a dumpster 20 feet away. The operative closest to the flames stumbled backward, temporarily blinded. Marcus moved like a ghost, years of Arctic combat training guiding his steps through the treacherous ice and debris. He reached the man before his vision cleared and struck with surgical precision at the base of his skull. The operative dropped silently into the snow. Contact down, northwest position, came a voice through the storm. Professional. Calm. These weren't street thugs. Marcus relieved the unconscious man of his weapon, a military-grade pistol with a full magazine, and his communication device. Through the earpiece he heard tactical chatter in accented English. Russian, but not quite right. Eastern European, maybe Czech or Polish. The flames from his fortress were dying down, but they'd served their purpose. In the flickering light, Marcus could see the remaining 2 operatives regrouping, using proper cover and concealment techniques. They were adapting quickly to his counterattack. He needed to move. Using the storm as cover, Marcus began working his way toward the mouth of the alley. Every step was calculated, every movement designed to avoid detection, but the ice beneath his feet betrayed him. A chunk of frozen debris shifted under his weight, clattering against a metal drain pipe. Gunfire erupted from 2 positions simultaneously. Bullets sparked off concrete and metal around him as he dove behind a cluster of trash cans. The operatives were closing in, using bounding overwatch techniques to advance while maintaining suppressive fire. Marcus keyed the stolen radio. "This is Blackwater 7, he said in his best approximation of the fallen operative's voice. "Target is moving south toward the street. I have pursuit." The gunfire stopped momentarily as the remaining operatives processed the false information. Marcus used the confusion to sprint toward the opposite end of the alley, where a fire escape hung just within reach. His fingers closed around the icy metal rungs, just as muzzle flashes lit up the alley behind him. The ladder was treacherous with ice, but his Arctic training had prepared him for exactly this kind of climb. Hand over hand, He pulled himself up into the darkness above. From his elevated position, he could see the two remaining operatives moving cautiously through the ruins of his cardboard fortress. They were searching for blood, for signs of a hit. Finding none, they began expanding their search pattern. Marcus settled in to wait and observe. The storm was his ally now, concealing him while forcing his hunters to expose themselves. But as he watched them work with cold efficiency, one question burned in his mind. How had they found him? The cardboard walls groaned under the relentless assault of ice and wind, but they held. Marcus pressed his back against the reinforced corner where two support beams met, feeling the vibrations travel through the structure with each gust. His breath came in short puffs, visible even in the dim amber glow of his improvised oil lamp. 3 days. The polar vortex had been hammering the city for 3 days, and his fortress had become an island of survival in a frozen wasteland. Outside, the temperature had plummeted to -40, turning the alleyway into a wind tunnel of death. But it wasn't the cold that made his hands shake as he checked his makeshift weapons. They were still out there. The scraping sound came again. Metal on concrete, deliberate and patient. Marcus had heard it twice in the past hour, circling his position like predators testing prey. Through a gap in his cardboard wall, he caught a glimpse of movement in the swirling snow. Dark figures, bundled and purposeful, moving with the coordination of a pack. He'd been naive to think the storm would drive them away. If anything, it gave them cover. Marcus reached for the modified tent pole he'd sharpened to a point, his military training flooding back despite years of trying to forget. The muscle memory was still there. How to move silently, how to read threats, how to kill when killing was the only option left. His time in the Arctic had taught him that survival wasn't just about enduring the elements, it was about recognizing when the greatest danger came from other human beings. A shadow passed by the main entrance to his fortress. Marcus held his breath, counting heartbeats. The figure paused and he could hear muffled voices through the storm. They were planning something. He'd built escape routes, learned that lesson the hard way during his second winter in Afghanistan. 3 different exits, each disguised and reinforced, but in this weather, running meant exposure, and exposure meant death within minutes. His fortress was both sanctuary and trap. The voices grew clearer as the wind momentarily died. Has to be in there. Waited long enough. Storm won't last forever. Marcus recognized the accent, the same crew that had been pressuring the other homeless camps, demanding tribute, territory, submission. He'd avoided them by staying mobile, but the storm had pinned him down. Now they'd found him, and they wanted what little he had. Or maybe they just wanted to send a message about what happened to those who didn't fall in line. A scraping sound from his left, someone testing the western wall. Marcus shifted position, gripping his weapon tighter. The cardboard might stop the wind, but it wouldn't stop a knife or a crowbar. His advantage was knowing the layout of his fortress better than they did, understanding which walls were load-bearing and which were decoys. The assault came without warning. The main entrance tore open with a violent ripping sound, and a figure lunged through wielding a metal pipe. Marcus was ready. Years of close-quarters combat training kicked in as he drove the sharpened pole upward, catching his attacker in the shoulder. The man screamed and stumbled backward into the storm. "He's armed!" The shout came from somewhere to his right. Marcus heard footsteps crunching through snow, positioning for a coordinated attack. He grabbed his emergency kit and slipped toward his secondary exit, a carefully concealed flap near the back wall. But as he pushed through into the howling wind, strong hands grabbed his jacket. Marcus spun, driving his elbow back into soft flesh. His attacker grunted but held on, and suddenly they were both falling, rolling in the deep snow that had drifted against the alley wall. The cold hit him like a physical blow. Even through his layers, the wind cut through to skin, and he felt his exposed face beginning to numb immediately. His opponent was bigger, heavier, but Marcus had fought in conditions like this before. He used the man's weight against him, rolling and coming up on top, driving his knee into the attacker's ribs. More shapes emerged from his fortress. They'd breached multiple walls. Marcus saw the orange glow of his oil lamp flickering as wind poured through the broken structure. His sanctuary was compromised, and staying out in the open meant certain death. He broke away from his opponent and ran, not toward the street where more might be waiting, but deeper into the maze of dumpsters and loading docks behind the buildings. His breath burned in his lungs, and ice crystals formed on his beard as he moved. Every step was a gamble. The snow hid obstacles, and a twisted ankle now would be a death sentence. Behind him, angry voices shouted orders, but the storm was swallowing their words. Marcus pressed himself against a brick wall, gasping as the reality of his situation crystallized. His fortress was gone. The storm showed no signs of weakening, and somewhere in the white chaos behind him, hunters were still searching. He was back to basics now. Man against elements, against enemies, against time. The cardboard walls groaned under the relentless assault of wind and ice, each gust threatening to tear apart the fortress Marcus had spent days perfecting. He pressed his back against the reinforced corner, feeling the vibrations travel through the corrugated layers like tremors through bone. Outside, the polar vortex howled with the fury of a living thing, but inside his shelter, another kind of storm was brewing. The radio crackled to life again, Vincent's voice cutting through the static like a blade. "You can't hide forever, soldier boy. My men are closing in, and that little cardboard castle of yours won't stop what's coming." Marcus adjusted his grip on the makeshift spear he'd fashioned from a broken tent pole and the serrated edge of a can lid. His breath formed clouds in the frigid air, each exhalation a reminder of how little warmth remained in his body. The hypothermia was winning its slow war against his extremities, but his mind remained sharp, honed by years of survival training that no amount of alcohol or despair could completely erase. Through a carefully constructed viewing port, he watched the shadows moving beyond the swirling snow. Vincent's men were professional, but they were fighting on Marcus's terms now. The urban wilderness had become his battlefield, and every alley, every abandoned building, every piece of debris was a potential weapon or advantage. A soft scraping sound came from the eastern wall. Marcus held his breath, counting the seconds. 1, 2, 3. The sound came again, deliberate and measured. Someone was testing the structural integrity of his fortress, probing for weaknesses. He'd expected this. Moving with practiced silence despite his deteriorating physical condition, Marcus crawled to a secondary position he'd prepared near the shelter's rear exit. The cardboard tube he'd reinforced with wire and tape would serve as both escape route and funnel if things went badly. His fingers, numb with cold, fumbled for the tripwire he'd rigged to a collection of cans filled with screws and metal fragments. The eastern wall buckled inward as a knife blade pierced through the layered cardboard. A beam of flashlight cut through the darkness, sweeping left and right in search of its target. Marcus remained motionless, becoming one with the shadows he'd learned to navigate during those Black Ops missions a lifetime ago. "He's not here," a voice whispered. "Just some homeless guy's nest." "Check it anyway," came the reply. "Vincent wants this finished tonight." Marcus waited until the beam passed overhead, then struck. His spear found the gap between the man's tactical vest and collar, the improvised blade sliding home with surgical precision. The intruder dropped without a sound, his weapon clattering to the frozen ground. But the element of surprise was spent. Shouts erupted from multiple directions as Vincent's remaining men converged on the fortress. Automatic weapons fire shredded the cardboard walls, sending fragments of Marcus's carefully constructed sanctuary flying like confetti in a hurricane. He triggered his tripwire trap as he rolled through the escape tunnel, the explosion of metal and noise buying him precious seconds. The polar vortex embraced him as he emerged into the open, the wind chill dropping the effective temperature to -40 degrees. His exposed skin began to freeze almost immediately, but the adrenaline coursing through his system provided a temporary buffer against the cold's killing embrace. "There!" Vincent's voice boomed over the storm. "Don't let him reach the overpass!" Marcus stumbled through knee-deep snow, his fortress crumbling behind him as the remaining gunmen riddled it with bullets. Each step was agony, his frostbitten feet screaming in protest, but he forced himself forward. The overpass represented more than just shelter from the wind. It was where he'd cached his final surprises. A muzzle flash lit up the swirling snow to his right. The bullet struck a concrete pillar inches from his head, sending chips of frozen debris into his cheek. He dove behind an abandoned shopping cart, using it as mobile cover while he zigzagged toward his destination. The cache was exactly where he'd hidden it 3 days ago, buried beneath a pile of refuse that the wind had sculpted into a natural blind. His numb fingers closed around the military-grade thermite charges he'd salvaged from a construction site, along with the electronic detonator he'd jury-rigged from a broken radio. Vincent emerged from the storm like a spectre, his expensive coat stark against the white landscape. "End of the line, Marcus. You've caused me considerable inconvenience." Marcus stood slowly, the detonator hidden behind his back. Around him, the support pillars of the overpass gleamed with a thin coating of ice. "You should have left me alone, Vincent. Some sleeping dogs are better left undisturbed." "Perhaps, but you knew too much about my operations, and desperate men make unpredictable choices." Vincent raised his pistol, the barrel unwavering despite the howling wind. "Time to finish what we started in Kandahar." Marcus smiled, his lips cracked and bleeding from the cold. "You're right about one thing. Desperate men are unpredictable." His thumb found the detonator's trigger. "But you forgot what they taught us about controlling the battlefield." The charges detonated simultaneously, turning the night into day. The wind screamed through the abandoned warehouse district with the fury of a wounded animal. Marcus pressed his back against the corrugated metal wall, his breath forming crystalline clouds in the sub-zero air. The cardboard fortress that had sheltered him for weeks lay in ruins 50 yards behind him, reduced to soggy fragments by Victor's men before they'd torched what remained. His military training whispered survival protocols through chattering teeth. Keep moving. Find cover. Assess threats. The polar vortex had transformed the industrial wasteland into an Arctic battlefield, but the real enemy wasn't the cold anymore. It was the 3 figures advancing through the swirling snow, their thermal scopes cutting red beams through the white chaos. Marcus clutched the knife he'd salvaged from his destroyed shelter, its handle slick with melting snow. The blade felt pathetic against automatic weapons, but desperation had a way of making the impossible seem merely improbable. He'd survived worse odds in Afghanistan, though he'd had proper gear then, not the threadbare layers of a man society had forgotten. The crunch of boots on ice grew closer. Victor's voice carried on the wind, that same cultured tone that had once offered him work, then threatened his life when Marcus discovered what kind of work it really was. Human trafficking disguised as homeless outreach programs. Bodies that disappeared when the weather turned deadly, written off as exposure deaths that nobody investigated too closely. "Marcus!" Victor called out, his accent thick with false concern. "This storm will kill us all if we stay out here. Come with us. Warm food, clean clothes, a real bed. All you have to do is forget what you saw." The offer might have been tempting if Marcus hadn't seen the shallow graves behind the soup kitchen, hadn't watched Victor's men load drugged homeless people into unmarked vans. The military had taught him to read people, and Victor read like a death sentence written in friendly ink. Marcus slipped around the corner of the building, his frozen fingers barely maintaining their grip on the knife. The wind howled louder, drowning out his footsteps. 20 feet ahead, another warehouse offered potential shelter, but crossing the open ground would expose him to their thermal sights. He needed a distraction. The propane tank abandoned near a defunct loading dock caught his eye. Military demolitions training kicked in, calculating blast radius and shrapnel patterns. Not ideal, but workable. Marcus pulled out his lighter, the flame dancing wildly in the vicious wind. "Stupid bastard, probably froze to death already," one of Victor's men shouted over the storm. "We should head back before we join him." "He's here," Victor replied, certainty edging his words. "Former special forces don't die easy. That's what makes them valuable and dangerous." Marcus crept toward the propane tank, each step deliberate despite the urgency clawing at his chest. The metal was so cold it burned his bare hands as he worked to open the valve. Gas hissed out, invisible in the swirling snow but sharp in his nostrils. The red dots of the thermal scopes swept closer, painting the warehouse walls like deadly constellations. Marcus counted to 10, letting the gas disperse, then touched his lighter to the growing cloud. The explosion lit up the night like a miniature sun, sending a shockwave through the warehouse district. It rattled windows 3 blocks away. Marcus was already moving before the flames reached their peak, sprinting across the open ground while Victor's men dove for cover. Gunfire erupted behind him, muzzle flashes strobing through the orange glow of the burning gas. Bullets whined off metal and concrete, but the explosion had temporarily blinded their thermal equipment. Marcus reached the far warehouse and rolled through a broken window, glass shards tearing at his clothes. Inside, the temperature dropped even further. Ice crystals formed in the air itself, and his breath came in desperate gasps that burned his lungs. But the walls blocked the wind, and more importantly, they blocked line of sight. Marcus moved deeper into the building, his eyes adjusting to the darkness. Abandoned machinery loomed like sleeping giants, and somewhere in the maze of equipment lay the tools for his final stand. The storm might last for hours more, but Victor wouldn't wait. He'd come in fast and hard, trying to end this before the cold claimed them all. The homeless had always been invisible to most people, but tonight that invisibility would become Marcus's greatest weapon. He knew these streets, these buildings, these forgotten corners where society's discards learned to survive. Victor might have guns and training, but Marcus had something more valuable. He had nothing left to lose. The warehouse door exploded inward with a shower of splinters and snow. 3 silhouettes moved through the breach, weapons raised, thermal scopes sweeping the darkness. Marcus smiled grimly from his hiding spot 20 feet above them, perched in the building's skeletal rafters. The hunt was about to become a war. The wind screamed through the city with prehistoric fury, turning the alley into a frozen hellscape where breath crystallized before it could leave his lungs. Marcus pressed his back against the corrugated metal wall of his cardboard fortress, feeling the structure shudder with each Arctic blast. 3 days of the polar vortex had transformed his carefully engineered shelter into something that resembled a battle-scarred bunker more than the desperate construction of a homeless man. Through a gap in his defenses, he watched the shadow move again. It had been circling for hours now, just beyond the reach of the flickering streetlight that provided his only illumination. Not human. The gait was wrong, too fluid, too deliberate. The thing that had been hunting him since the storm began wasn't giving up, even as the temperature plummeted to levels that should have driven every living creature to seek shelter. His fingers numb despite the wool gloves he'd scavenged, fumbled for the tactical knife he'd kept hidden for months. The military training that had once made him invaluable in the Arctic came flooding back, not just the survival techniques that had kept him alive these past 72 hours, but the combat instincts he'd tried so hard to bury beneath years of civilian life and subsequent fall from grace. The cardboard walls groaned ominously as another gust hit. Marcus had reinforced them with salvaged plastic sheeting, newspapers and strips of duct tape bartered from other street dwellers who'd long since fled to warmer shelters. His fortress was an engineering marvel born of desperation, with multiple layers creating insulating air pockets, strategic ventilation holes that could be quickly sealed, and even a crude chimney system for the small candle that provided precious warmth. But engineering couldn't protect him from what lurked outside. A scratching sound echoed off the alley walls, claws on concrete, deliberate and patient. Marcus controlled his breathing, slowing his heart rate using techniques learned during reconnaissance missions in places the government preferred to forget. Whatever was out there could probably smell his fear, hear his heartbeat, sense his warmth against the bitter cold. The scratching stopped. Silence stretched between the wind gusts, more terrifying than any sound. Marcus shifted slightly, trying to peer through a different gap in his defenses. The streetlight cast long shadows that danced and writhed, making it impossible to distinguish between threats and imagination. Then he saw it, yellow eyes reflecting the dim light, positioned too high off the ground to belong to any dog or cat. His mind catalogued possibilities with military precision. Escaped zoo animal, unlikely given the storm's intensity. Feral dog pack leader, possible, but the eyes were wrong. Something else entirely, something that had been drawn by the same urban decay that had claimed his life and brought him to this frozen purgatory. The creature moved closer, and Marcus caught his first clear glimpse. Lean and wolf-like, but larger, with fur so dark it seemed to absorb light. Its breath created clouds of steam that dissipated instantly in the brutal wind. This was no ordinary predator. This was something that thrived in conditions that killed everything else. Marcus gripped his knife tighter and made a decision that would have seemed insane to the man he'd been before homelessness stripped away his illusions about civilization and safety. Instead of waiting for the attack, he pushed through the overlapping cardboard flaps that served as his door and stepped into the alley. The cold hit him like a physical blow, stealing his breath and making his eyes water instantly. But he'd survived worse conditions during military operations, and the familiar bite of Arctic air brought clarity instead of panic. The creature was 20 feet away, watching him with intelligent eyes that held no fear of humans. "Come on then," Marcus whispered, his words lost in the wind. The wolf thing tilted its head, as if considering his challenge. For a moment that stretched into eternity, man and beast regarded each other across the frozen wasteland the city had become. Then the creature did something unexpected. It turned and padded away into the darkness, disappearing between abandoned cars buried under snowdrifts. Marcus stood in the killing cold for another minute, making sure it was really gone. His fortress beckoned, promising relative warmth and shelter, but he knew the true battle was over. He'd faced the thing that had been hunting him, shown it he wasn't easy prey, and somehow that was enough. As he crawled back into his cardboard sanctuary, Marcus realized something had changed. The howling wind no longer sounded like death approaching. It sounded like the voice of a world he understood, a world where survival depended on courage, preparation, and the willingness to stand your ground when everything else fell apart. The polar vortex would break eventually. The city would thaw, but Marcus knew he'd already survived the hardest test, not just the cold or the predator, but the discovery that somewhere beneath the layers of failure and despair, the man he'd once been was still alive.